Okay, so a startup with 3 employees just destroyed a $1 billion company. The startup had no resources, no connections, and no safety net. What if I told you this happens constantly because having nothing to lose is the most dangerous competitive advantage? The desperate player always beats the comfortable player. Not sometimes, always. Everyone believes security creates strength and vulnerability creates weakness. People with resources should outperform people without resources consistently. But competitive systems reveal something different about how desperation functions. The person with everything to protect plays not to lose. The person with nothing to protect plays to win. These are fundamentally different games with predictable different outcomes. Think about the last time someone told you to build a safety net first. They assume security enables risk-taking and bold action over time. But observe what actually happens when people gain security. Risk tolerance decreases dramatically as assets accumulate. The entrepreneur who risked everything at 20 becomes conservative at 40, not because wisdom increased, but because loss aversion intensified. Why does gaining resources make people more afraid? This creates what strategists call the commitment paradox in competitive environments. If you wonder why underdogs keep beating favorites despite obvious disadvantages, subscribe now. This channel reveals the hidden mechanisms that make desperation more powerful than preparation. Share this with someone who thinks they need more resources before taking action. They need to understand why waiting for security guarantees losing. The mechanism operates through asymmetric stakes that create asymmetric behavior patterns. When you have significant resources to protect, every decision involves loss calculation. The wealthy investor considers how each choice might damage existing portfolio value. The established company worries how innovation might cannibalize current revenue streams. The champion boxer protects his undefeated record rather than pursuing aggressive victory. Each actor optimizes for preservation, not advancement. But the player with nothing faces completely different incentive structures. The broke entrepreneur cannot lose wealth he does not possess. The unknown fighter cannot damage a reputation that does not exist yet. The insurgent army cannot sacrifice resources it never controlled. This absence of downside risk fundamentally changes strategic calculation. When you cannot lose what you lack, failure costs nothing. Consider how this plays out in startup versus corporate competition dynamics. Microsoft had dominant operating system market share when smartphones emerged. They possessed massive resources, engineering talent, and market power, yet they lost to Apple and Google despite overwhelming apparent advantages. Why? Microsoft optimized to protect existing Windows revenue streams. Every mobile decision got filtered through desktop preservation concerns. Innovation that might hurt Windows got blocked internally. Apple and Google approached mobile with nothing to lose in operating systems. Neither company had desktop OS market share worth protecting. This freedom allowed aggressive innovation without internal political resistance. They could experiment radically because radical experiments could not damage non-existent assets. Microsoft played not to lose. Apple and Google played to win. The desperation advantage determined the outcome. The same dynamic appears in military asymmetric warfare throughout history. The United States military possessed overwhelming technological superiority in Vietnam, advanced aircraft precision weapons, and unlimited financial resources. Yet they lost to peasant guerrilla fighters with basic rifles. The asymmetry seemed impossible to overcome from the conventional perspective. But analyze the stakes each side faced in that conflict. American soldiers fought for political objectives thousands of miles from home. Loss meant political embarrassment and career damage for generals. Victory meant maintaining credibility in global power competition. These are abstract stakes with limited personal consequences. Vietnamese fighters fought for survival of families' villages and national independence. Loss meant death, slavery, or permanent foreign occupation. Victory meant freedom and dignity. When the stakes are existential, desperation creates performance levels that comfort cannot match. The Vietnamese could accept casualties that would collapse American political will. They could endure hardship that would seem intolerable to wealthy societies. They possessed infinite time because they had nowhere else to go. America possessed limited time because domestic patience eventually expires. Desperation 1. Corporate bankruptcy creates similar desperation dynamics that often produce surprising turnarounds. When a company faces imminent collapse, normal constraints disappear instantly. Political considerations become irrelevant when survival is at stake. Career preservation concerns evaporate when everyone might lose their jobs. Sacred cows get slaughtered because tradition cannot save dying organizations. The desperate leadership tries radical experiments that careful planning would reject forever. Sometimes these desperate experiments work precisely because desperation enabled attempts that stability prevented. Steve Jobs returned to Apple when the company faced bankruptcy and dissolution. This desperate situation gave him permission to ignore normal business constraints completely. He killed most product lines despite furious protests from division managers. He made exclusive deals with Microsoft that seemed strategically insane. He bet everything on colorful computers that conventional wisdom said would fail. He simplified the product line from dozens to 4 models. This radical simplification seemed reckless, but desperation created freedom that comfort never permits. Apple's resurrection came from having nothing left to lose. Lego faced similar existential crisis in early 2000s near bankruptcy. They tried everything conventional wisdom recommended and still approached collapse. Desperation forced radical rethinking of fundamental business model assumptions. They killed unprofitable product lines despite emotional attachment. They focused obsessively on core brick building despite pressure to diversify. They partnered with entertainment franchises which seemed desperate at the time. This desperation-driven strategy reversed decades of decline. The turnaround happened because collapse removed comfortable options. Compare this to how established profitable companies operate in stable environments. They optimize existing successful formulas rather than pursuing uncertain innovation. Experimentation gets limited to safe, incremental improvements. Radical proposals die in committee reviews and risk analysis. The profitable company has too much to protect. Protection instinct overwhelms innovation instinct. Comfort guarantees stagnation. Athletes demonstrate this pattern clearly in competitive performance under pressure. The unknown challenger fights with reckless abandon and total commitment. He has no ranking to protect, no endorsement deals to preserve. Loss means returning to obscurity, which is simply his current state. This freedom produces aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous performance. Champions often struggle against this energy. The defending champion carries burden of expectations and loss aversion. Defeat means public humiliation, damaged brand value, and questioning of legacy. Victory merely maintains current status rather than advancing position. The champion fights carefully to avoid mistakes. The challenger fights recklessly to create opportunities. Careful fighting cannot match reckless fighting when skill levels are comparable. Investment behavior shows identical dynamics across wealth levels and time horizons consistently. Poor investors with small capital take aggressive, concentrated positions by necessity. They cannot build wealth through safe, diversified strategies with tiny amounts. Their only path to significant returns requires accepting significant concentrated risk. This desperation produces occasional spectacular successes when concentrated bets work perfectly. Most fail, but the few successes can change everything. Wealthy investors protect capital through diversification and conservative allocation strategies. They already have enough money for comfortable life and legacy preservation. Additional returns provide marginal utility that barely improves daily existence. But losses would damage existing lifestyle status and family security. Risk aversion dominates every decision-making process. The wealthy investor plays not to lose. The desperate investor plays to win. Over long time periods, desperation strategy often produces better outcomes despite higher failure rate. Warren Buffett made his fortune through concentrated bets when he had nothing. His early investments put huge percentages into single positions. This concentration created enormous returns that compounding could multiply. As wealth grew, his strategy became more conservative and diversified. The desperation advantage faded as comfort increased. His best returns came when he had nothing to lose. Even negotiation dynamics favor the desperate party in many situations. When you need the deal desperately, your willingness to walk away seems incredible. This creates negotiating leverage that comfort cannot match. The person who can actually walk away controls the negotiation. But walking away requires having nothing to lose from failed negotiation. The comfortable negotiator needs to preserve relationship, maintain reputation, and avoid appearance of unreasonableness. These constraints limit negotiating positions and acceptable outcomes. The desperate negotiator can make extreme demands, threaten scorched earth, and risk total breakdown. This credible willingness to accept terrible outcomes often forces better terms. Desperation creates negotiating freedom. Revolutionary movements throughout history demonstrate how desperation enables actions that security prevents consistently. Comfortable populations rarely revolt regardless of ideological disagreements or policy objections. They have jobs, families, property, and daily comforts worth protecting. Revolution risks losing everything they currently possess and value. The risk calculation favors acceptance of imperfect systems over uncertain alternatives. But populations with nothing left to lose become revolutionary fuel that ignites. When people face starvation, homelessness, and death anyway, revolution costs nothing additional. The desperate population can sustain sacrifice that comfortable populations cannot imagine enduring. They will fight for years, endure enormous casualties, and accept terrible hardship. Desperation creates revolutionary capacity that comfort destroys systematically. The French Revolution emerged from desperate peasants with nothing to lose. The aristocracy possessed everything and fought to preserve existing order. Yet the desperate peasants defeated the comfortable aristocracy despite massive resource disadvantages. The American Revolution followed identical pattern with colonists risking everything. The Cuban Revolution succeeded because guerrillas had nothing but desperation. The pattern repeats across centuries because the mechanism remains constant. This explains why empires consistently lose to insurgent movements over time. The empire fights to maintain distant territories and abstract strategic interests. Soldiers serve for pay benefits and career advancement. These are economic relationships without existential commitment. The insurgent fights for home, family survival, and identity. These are existential stakes that create unlimited commitment. Economic motivation cannot compete with existential motivation. The pattern appears so consistently across domains that it reveals a fundamental truth about human performance. Security does not create strength. Security creates comfort. Comfort creates risk aversion. Risk aversion creates conservative behavior. Conservative behavior loses to aggressive behavior. Therefore, security creates losing. This chain runs backward from conventional wisdom, but forward through actual outcomes. Look at any competitive domain and identify who has nothing to lose. That player holds structural advantage regardless of apparent resource disadvantage. The startup versus corporation. The insurgent versus empire. The challenger versus champion. The desperate investor versus wealthy investor. The revolutionary versus establishment. The pattern repeats endlessly because the underlying mechanism never changes. Having nothing to lose creates freedom to act without constraint. This freedom enables experimentation, risk-taking, and total commitment. These behaviors produce occasional spectacular success and frequent failure. But in competitive environments, one spectacular success often outweighs many failures. The desperate player only needs to win once. The comfortable player must win every time. Asymmetric outcomes favor asymmetric commitment. Understanding this mechanism changes how you evaluate competitive situations. Stop asking who has more resources, better technology, or superior organization. Start asking who has nothing to lose. That answer predicts outcomes more reliably than conventional advantage analysis. The desperate player wins not despite having nothing to lose, but because having nothing to lose